Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us in this webinar. My name is Susanna Yeti. I'm the Agency Portfolio Marketing Manager here at PECB, and I will be your host for today. Today's topic is ISO 40031, the business value of environmental performance evaluation. To talk about all the benefits when you gain when you implement this standard, joining us is PECB certified ISO 30001 risk manager in the Philippines and the senior consultant for ISO programs of SAS Management, Mr. Joshua Albarina. I would like to remind you that you will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions in the question pane of the control panel. Now we will turn the time over to Mr. Albarina, and Mr. Albarina, you may start the presentation.
Thank you, Susanna, and good day, everyone, regardless of the time zones you are now around the world. And welcome to this webinar on ISO 14031. Now, I'm not sure if every one of you are familiar with the, not actually standard, it's a guideline. As we all know that this is part of the family of standards on ISO 14000, where we all know that not long is that the ISO 14031 has its recent release last year. Actually, that's in the mid-year of 2015. And there's a lot of changes in the new standard that it's quite noteworthy to the point that even this guideline on ISO 14031 has also to take into full consideration. And I think this would be something that for any environmental practitioner worth the attention. And so we'll have a closer look on what this guideline would mean and how can this provide value to any organization practicing ISO 14001. And so this will be the sequences of our discussion, and in this quite a jam-packed webinar topic, we'll try to condense complex topics into a very simple, logical, and straightforward explanation on what ISO 14031 would mean. Here in the Philippines, this guideline is apparently not as famous as with any other countries around the world would be, considering that majority of the companies who are implementing here are mostly inclined to ISO 14000 and basically for business compliance. But there's a lot of impact when one touches this document or this guideline. There's a lot of things that environmental, especially for organizations who are very particular on environmental practice, and they see that implementing environmental practice as an organization would be something valuable to the business and among its interested parties and stakeholders alike. So in this discussion, if this is new to you, then consider this as a very, very simple orientation. But for those who are not new to this guideline, then you can get an idea or some benchmark in order to build a comprehensive, substantial, and should we say valuable developing indicators or should we say metrics to consistent or comprehensively measured and measure environmental management systems, or more or less environmental practices, and that the measurements that you produce to the top, that you present to the top management will somehow be of tune, because most of the time the reports apparently, I don't know, I'm not sure if everyone agrees with me here in this discussion, but for most of those who are practicing environmental management, we always present metrics and indicators, but when it is raised to the top management, it doesn't really, somehow it doesn't really create, should we say, a tough impression, especially that it hasn't have translated into financial aspects. So the way into going into that, one has to understand that there's even an environmental guideline corresponding to financial to translating environmental measures or environmental impacts into financial cases, something that the business group would need. And in order for you to get into there, you will need ISO 14051. But the idea on those practices and getting in measuring, defining the metrics, and defining the right metrics across organization levels, this is the guideline that you need to handle. So may this webinar be very simple in substance. So the first one is to appreciate the concepts of EPE, and how can you should we say, describe the environmental performance of the organization qualitatively and quantitatively, and and see and try to find ways where this can this define the value. And then as you will find some of the concepts of EPE, um, on my side, I will try my best to give you some ideas, ideas in building up indicators that would surely help, that should surely help improve the environmental performance and are just right for the organizational context. So let's get started. We all know that in 14001, the EMS has already 10 major clauses in line with the recent requirements. All of the standards have to be has to follow a standard table of contents, so we call it the Annex SL or the high level outline. Now, of the 10 outlines, clause number 9 is one of the most one of the last part or the last ditches of the standard, typically because it's more on the check side, or the check and the act check that would lead the organization to look for actions or in the act phase if we follow the PDCA. So clause 9 in this context, we call it the performance evaluation, and it's basically categorized into 3 sectors. One is the monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation, which basically assesses the organization's environmental performance in relation to business objectives. And then the second one is how the organization conforms to audit to the requirements of the international standard, which for an organization would give them a check and balance on what is the best practice for environmental management system, and if they wanted to see how they conform, then there is an international standard with a set of requirements that would commensurate to it. And finally, the third one is more of consolidation, and then a review and an evaluation of what has been collected, what has been measured, and what has been assessed for, and then find out proactively what will be the next steps. We all know that one. This is not. This is something that has already been introduced way back in the previous version of the standard, and that is management review. And this has been so perpetually recognized for any other standards as well. Now, significant to 14,000, the question would be, where would 14,031 would complement? It's actually on the first section, that's the monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. Now, this practice, despite the fact that 14,031 is not is somehow for a few would be new to the ears of the folk, if we trace back industrial environmental practices, this has been already going on for decades since the release of cleaner production, and all the more that's important right now, because there's a lot of value in defining the right environmental performance, so that we will be able to have we will be able to scientifically validate, well, perhaps in the near future, what would be what is the industry's contribution to the inventory of greenhouse gases emissions. And we all know that it's a very popular standard where it talks about how you monitor your what you call greenhouse gas emissions. That's the ISO 14064. But we'll not talk about that one for the time being. But instead, we talk about this, which is very crucial. And as we all know, that 14,001 is talking about environmental performance for businesses, so we talk about the process in general. Now, when we talk about the process in general, or we talk about the organization, we had to start somewhere over here. The reason is that for any organization who wants to implement an environmental practice, anything that we account not just the business materials, but also the environmental aspects as well, including water, energy, fuel, and then also when we also take into account the emissions or the releases, we take out the products, the services, the excess, and the emissions. Now, as per the new definition of the process, we know that all these three points have to have a level of control or feedback mechanism just to make sure that everything is well under the performance. If we all are familiar with ISO 9001 or the quality management system, this is more of checking the performance metrics of the business process, which in turn, when properly implemented, this would create an advantage for the environmental context. Now, this process in general, what the management systems or the 14001 does is it looks on it in general. So that's why it's more in this sketch is more enveloped. This process is basically enveloped for one reason. It's because you don't look not just on the process, but you also look on the various environmental aspects and how the organization has contributed to the environmental impacts, whether it is positive or negative, to the surroundings, and more importantly to the environment from which over a certain radius as well. Now, just to have a little bit of a review, there are two guidelines associated. I mentioned to you earlier, two guidelines associated on it, and that is the performance evaluation on the ISO 14031, and to account specifically for material flows in the process, that means the raw products from production process to materials and outputs in excess, we have the ISO 14051 or the material flow in cost accounting. And in addition to that, this is a very beautiful guideline for the reason that it's not just only accounting material flows, but it also accounts more or less the accounting aspect of how these material flows in the organization. A good question that would come up here in this in this area is, what's the difference between the conventional accounting practice in the industry across environmental accounting here? Well, more or less is not so much difference, but it's more now inclined not just only on the financial, but also in the environmental impact in terms of the very popular unit of measurement in terms of emissions. We have the CO2 equivalents, which we all know for certain at this point in time that the emissions can be perfectly traded into what you call this carbon taxes, and that's why there are already small organizations who's already planting trees, putting up a business, makes it what we call as the carbon sinks. Australia is already in the lead for this, and we've already heard a lot of companies in Australia. Even if I'm a Filipino, but I do know some international global context when it comes to environmental accounting. There are a lot of industries right now in Australia that's already using carbon credits as a business. And this actually is a very good one, but of course, it always comes on two sides of the coin. There will be always cons to it. But that would be a very good innovation in the coming years for organizations to see the value of doing environmental practice as a potential revenue source. Now, going back into Clause 9, the three main definitions to review is in simple essence, in monitoring is more on determining the status of the system, and the measurement is a process to determine a value. And when you talk about performance evaluation, it's a process of determining measurable results. So simply put, all of the things that we are doing, from writing up a policy on environment, if we're going to look at environmental management system, from setting up a policy, from planning, from assessment of environmental impacts, and then establishing environmental programs, and auditing the environmental management system, but that's in the other side, but that's in the audit. But more or less you can correlate that in some fashion. So when you talk about monitoring, measurement, and performance evaluation, the essence here is that even environmental aspects needs to be properly measured because the company is basically investing sums of resources just to get the organization implement an ISO 14001 or simply an environmental practice, which in turn it is expected for this practice to create a value. And so the fact that it has to create a value on the management perspective, so we put this as a basic control. And as per popular quote, you cannot simply manage what you can you cannot manage, what you cannot measure. So I have to make my corrections in the slide. It should be cannot measure. So the same is true for the other side, is that if you measure it, you can manage it. And it also goes true for environmental practice, although it needs a little bit of stringency. And how to do that one, it's 14031. Now, when these, well, the basic output of ISO 14031, where would this go, is that it triggers on environmental performance within the organization, and with particularly the internal context, and also put aside the external context. But specific to the internal context, it would be a piece of information for them where they can do a check and balance on their environmental improvements, putting aside also the business aspect of the organization. So when we talk about the benefit of 14031 across 3 levels, we start with the top management, and they're basically focused on the products and services, knowing that they can effectively get the knowledge of the progress of environmental practice within the organization. Then you can imagine that the executives, on the other hand, they want to check the value of this practice. They want to see how can a good environmental performance create a level of impression to its stakeholders, and how can they gain businesses in the long run. It sounds so pragmatic, albeit straightforward, but it is something that it is really something that it's business in nature, and it has to make sense because on moral grounds, everyone is involved in the organization and they got to work on it. And so for a company that wants, for a company who's reasonably investing for an environmental practice, it also means that they have to see the value of or the return or potential returns of investment for implementing environmental management practice. But so that is left to us environmental practitioners to find ways into creating a good tone. So if in case that happens, then 14031 would be a good guideline to check what's the environmental performance that would give the top management a level of knowledge that they could use. Either they can use it for purposes of reputation or for purposes of compliance, from which most of the companies here in the Philippines are operating or are investing for. It's basically compliance. But it has a sense, though. I mean, as with any other regulatory acts in various countries, particular for environmental management practice, especially at this point in time that around the world, the Paris 2030 targets are already been put into force. So I'm pretty sure that a few of the some countries will have to put some policy measures from which organizations should be aware, and the top management needs to be aware in order that to keep their business steady. They got to find ways in order to sort of report on the level of accuracy and precision their environmental performance. Going further, on the process level, that's on the management aspect. So we're talking about the mid-level managers who are handling basically processes. So indicators would be a very useful tool for them to check while they're performing on the business side, what's going to be in it for them on the environmental side of the process. So it's more of a conscious, environmentally conscious practice, and that's why a lot of innovations such as paperless process, which is at the moment is quite impossible, but I think there's already technologies that's noteworthy that can be possible though. Although some businesses cannot go away with paper, so it's more like how can we reduce the use of paper in the processes in the way we do the work. So process managers, when they are shown with these indicators, they could be given a level of a level of information that's necessary for them to retrofit their practices to not just only to improve the process, but also to make it environmentally friendly as well. The third one is more on the staff level or the first line level, or what we call this operations or activity levels. And what would these small measures do for them? it's actually significant because majority of environmental measures are actually on the activity levels, small low-hanging fruits. As with the concept of cleaner production, for environmental practices to work and to really sustain and build in practice, you have to start from the low-hanging fruits and then slowly climb your way up to high investment options. That's a very good step a recommended step for organizations wanting to build up a good presence in in building up an environmental management system, or should we say making an effective environmental management system. So a good investment on the top should begin with small practices on the bottom. And this is a very good practice also, a good level of transformation for organizations, such a manner that environmental practice needs not to be invested heavily, but it is something that as all of us, it's a responsibility to perform. Now, we talk about environmental practices, we talk about enforcement of policies, we are talking about how will this create value. So when we talk about creating a value, it's more on how can we build those metrics and then use these metrics to evaluate our performance. So in ISO 14031, the metrics are the ones that are given of weight, and it is a very good instrument for successful management of environmental performance, like I've mentioned before, and it typically consists of around 3 points: plan, do, and act. So when you say do, it's basically control, and monitoring is more like an act of act practice. As with the basic requirements of 14031, it has 3 basic steps. That's planning or defining the dashboards or planning the indicators, and doing or ensure collect data and monitor, and then use statistical methods or use trends, use charts to evaluate and translate data, environmental data to environmental information, and then check if this is and if these records are significant or are valuable to the organization, then there is a monitoring action, and that's why there are sort of industry benchmarks or internal standards when it comes to such performance. Now, some of the practices that organizations one of these days, they've talking about, when they talk about environmental performance, it's got to have a deeper level of analysis. Now, it may sound a dedication, a dedicated practice, but it's worth it really. And I've never seen, and I've seen some organizations who really put environmental practice to the test. There's a huge difference when between an organization with not much of a practice in environmental management between an organization with a very good environmental management practice. It really seeps down to the culture, and how is that possible? A good metric dashboard. Sometimes that's even called as the corporate environmental indicator. So sometimes called as the CEI. And then the next question, so in building up 14031, the first good question will be is how indicators are classified. Indicators, to answer this simply, you go back to the 3 levels: the internal structure, strategic, tactical, and operational. In the similar way, it's also classified into this level. When say, let's start with an organization. An organization wants to build up an environmental management practice. Now, when you start an environmental practice, you are aware that the scope would also include the environment, just around the surroundings. So this first level of indicators is talking about what are the indicators that tells the progress of the environmental performance of an organization with respect to the external environment. And this we establish our the environmental condition indicators, for which later on I'll explain. Now, in the context, in the internal context, in this convention, it's split into 2: organization and operations. So you can see here the dotted lines would somehow represent the mid-level management, and that's something that and that sets the borderline between information, knowledge, and data. Now, an organization on a management level, they have to check the environmental condition of the environment, and also what interested parties want from this organization with respect to environmental compliance. And the communication is actually internal between the day-to-day activities and the management's performance. So for most of the companies, it's more on the physical facilities, equipment, and may I add, it's also about it's also more on the raw materials as well, and water consumption and energy consumption, and the practice of environmental practices within the organization, small practices I mean, or cultural practice that I would be specific. Now, in the case of physical facilities and equipments, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, and they are that is also have to be taken into full factor. Now, with this orientation, the three categories of indicators are same. First, on the external facet, we have the environmental condition indicators. On the management level, we have the management performance indicators, sometimes known as the environmental dashboard or the CEI. The operational performance indicators are called as the OPI. This is more or less called as the department level indicators. And this is something that what we call, this will really warrant a good sort of, this operational performance indicators are the nitty-gritty aspects of coming up with that provides a set of information that will be useful for management performance indicators. Now, what are these three? Let's begin with the environmental condition indicators. An example of that is, well, obviously, the CO2 emissions. Let's take that for example. The CO2 emissions of the industry, especially for organizations that emits, that has a degree of emissions in the environment. So that's, and then also an example would be is the number of flora and fauna in the area, and then another would be as the number of animals in the place. So it's more like how biodiversity exists within the enterprise. You can consider that one as an environmental condition indicator. Now, on the management's perspective, we have the management performance indicators. This is actually more on the environmental indicators with the context of the management practice. So, for example, if you want to talk about processes involving in business processes in the administrative level, so definitely, what are the inputs? What are the outputs? So it has to be quite a level. It has to have a level of objectivity. Say, for example, how many papers are used in the in this department, and how many papers were released as junk? So that has to be well counted. Now, for some organizations, it might be a burden of work, but believe me, this is something worth counting for. The next one is the operational performance indicators. What on an activity level, it allows the assessment and control of environmental impacts at the process to activity level. So that is what we call as the operational performance indicators. Some examples, as you can see it right over here, I've even mentioned a bit earlier, but just to summarize the list of indicators, well, we have all of these three in. Now, how to come up with these sets of indicators? Now, that's a very good, now that's the next thing. So when you know that that these are the indicators, the next question is how to get there. 14031 has exquisitely defined this process, this sequence, and where do we all start? First, you have to plan. So you have to check on the environmental aspect. So if you're going on 14001, that's the environmental aspect impact analysis. So you want them to know what are the environmental aspects, and in the business, what are the corresponding impacts. So that's more of a risk assessment techniques. It's more like what are, it's a risk assessment technique actually here. But more importantly, it has to incline itself on if this is the aspect, if this is the impact, what are my measures of success? And we're going to see that one. And you have to the objective in this section is to define what are the initial indicators and what are its current baselines. Now, in doing so, for the implementation, you first collect the data. So you have to agree first the indicators. Now you need to know how you collect them. So you need to collect the data, then you analyze or you assess, and then assess this information. If this information has a level of validity and has a level of value to various levels, and then you report and communicate. And then, as soon as it is well reported, you have to review this practice again until it becomes, all the outputs of the review will be useful for the next planning session to basically improve your indicator sets. Now, our focus here is actually putting up the environmental indicators. As much as we have already defined this in ISO 14001, especially in clause 9.1, a good guideline for practice is now. We'll talk about the best practices on how to effectively define indicators. So we'll get there into the bottom. But meanwhile, let's talk about if you are going to define the indicators, what are the principles that needs to be internalized? So we have basically around 6 principles. First is comparability, orientation, the balance, continuity, timeliness, and clarity. So we go first with let's take on them one by one in a nutshell. When you talk about comparability, make sure that the indicators have results that are comparable either with respect to time or with respect to performance from one process to another. They must have at least, in this case we call it benchmarks, and these benchmarks should represent, should somehow give a resemblance or a representation of a corresponding impact, and it must be more like, it's more of putting up a check and balance on environmental performance. So there should be a level of comparability. Number 2, the target orientation. So when we talk about target orientation, when you define the indicators, you don't define the indicators simply because it's tasked to do so. Like let's take for example, you want to determine the volume of waste emitted. Now, you in your process, you want to know how much waste is emitted. So so when you are going to define you need to define an indicator that accounts for waste in the process. You don't look for the waste inside the process. You look for the waste outside the process. No, at the end of the process. So it's more like from which angle are you coming from in order to collect the indicators? Because on this principle, under the principles of target orientation, if the purpose of looking on the end of this specific angle, it's because it has a specific goal to achieve. You don't set a goal, you don't set an indicator with a goal not meeting a goal. You need to define indicators that meets specifically to the goal. That makes value in the case of making sense with the indicators. The third is balance. Now this is a tricky word, but when we talk about balance, it has a level of accuracy and precision. Now, it may sound so metrical, but then again, it's more about not just on the error, but how does this balance represent the process? How these indicators represent to the organization's environmental performance? And because it has to have a level of balance, the reason is when an organization looks for future investments on environmental practice, like for example, if they want to reduce environmental emissions, then they have to invest in technologies absorbing CO2, like we have the carbon scrubber technology. That's a very useful, that's a very investment intensive technology. Or they can look for certain alternatives in cleaning wastewater, because there are so many innovations right now on wastewater treatment. We all need to read on them. We need to look on them. It may sound a little bit of an investment, but there are so many benefits. At this point, it's a challenge for environmental practitioners to focus on the financial aspects of any environmental benefit. That's why in defining indicators, the balance, when we talk about balance, it's how the indicators represent the process and how it represents the value to the organization. The fourth is continuity. So when you talk about continuity, we are talking about what is the current baseline, what is the current benchmark, what will be the next performance, what will be the corresponding target, with the same set of data. Now, that means it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a new one. Defining new indicators doesn't have to be new. As much as possible, it has to be continuous. Reason behind is that we need historical data. The same approach in defining metrics for quality management is also the same also here. You see, we need to look for progress on how the company performs on environmental practice, because at some point, the top management will have to leave an answer. Yes, we are already financially, we're financially good, we have a good environmental performance, and the question is this: are we environmentally friendly? Then this environmental indicator sets will represent that one. And to do that one, it takes a trace back of data. That's why continuity for indicators is very important. Fourth one is timeliness. So it is not, this one talks about how does the environmental performance is accounted on a regular basis. Now this will take some due diligence at the operational level, a level of check on the, a level of frequent checks on the middle management level, and a level of creating strategic value on the top level. So how these indicators will create value to the organization, it has to be timely. The next, clarity. The same concept of balance, well, this needs not to be explained further. What should be understood here in this section is that your indicator, what does it represent? What does it do? Who is collecting it? And how are you collecting it? And what is its impact to the business? Now that level of practice should be clear on these indicators. That's why if we go back, that's actually more on the balance and the target orientation and timeliness of the indicators. And in so doing, when an organization performs or a well-defined environmental performance metrics, there are so many benefits on it. Like here in the Philippines, most organizations who are implementing ISO 14001, reasons behind is compliance. Now, legal compliance will have environmental data required. So so in this case, yes, you can put in data, but the data here makes sense and it represents the organization. It's all about organizational integrity here. Now, that is the way of enhancing it. The second one, reporting practices. We all know that most organizations right now, Singapore, for example, requires every organization to generate sustainability reports. Countries in Europe, like the ones in Central Europe, they are required to submit environmental reports every year. In the Philippines, sustainability reporting is slowly picking up speed. So where would they collect this one? I've just talked with an environmental specialist minutes ago, and she told me this. Do you know where all the data they got? You know where they get the data in order to create the report? It's from the environmental department. So the one who's leading the ISO 14001. So see, the value on 14031 can create a 14001. And it's also interesting to find out that in the Philippines, there are few who know what this standard tells. I'm also sharing some insight here. I mean, coming from a practitioner myself too. Now, reputation enhancement, that's a very good, that's an indirect but tangible output for a company implementing environmental practice with a good level of metrics as defined by 14031. Now, that being said, those are the principles. Now, the last part, what's the value now? When we talk about environmental performance and we talk about the practices, there are very simple, there are some practices that you can adapt actually. When defining indicators, I need you to listen now at this point in time because the slides are not here, but when an organization or when an environmental team wants to redevelop the environmental indicators, it's only simple as 1, 2, 3 sequence. First, for an environmental aspect, you look for the critical success factors. That's number 1. You look at what makes a good, the end in mind to ask for an environmental aspect is how can we make this environmentally friendly? Then you define what are the critical success factors. So for example, if you want to treat a wastewater, the question is this, and the requirements is that the effluent has to be on a certain level. So the question, well, if you want to set up a target, then the question will be is this: what makes a very good output effluent that would not just only comply, but will also increase its effectiveness? So what then are then the next question is, what are the critical success factors? Say for example, lower emissions, lower effluent outputs for wastewater that will be released to the rivers. The second one is this. What then are the indicators appropriate for that success factor? So, if you say if you say we want to have a lower effluent values on the wastewater. So then, what makes a lower effluent? Is it practice? Well, it's also in the process, right? So that's one, but it's a long shot, but it's one. Definitely, it will be process, and then the second one is the quality of water being used in the initial parts. So that will be it. The third one is, what are the metrics then? So then, if we go back to that practice, what are the specific points in a process that will create a level of measure that I am doing a process. I am already performing a process that lessens the output of effluent, that increases the quality of the effluent that is good enough to be released in on public channels, on public waters. So that in essence, if you notice, it can also spring out into several practices. So we are talking about this has also connection to quality practice. So when we talk about we need to improve environmental performance to reduce wastewater release. So we're talking about quality practice. So by just defining the simple critical success factors, indicators, and then metrics 1, 2, 3, and then that's it. At the very end, it's how the team has thoroughly dedicated itself to defining those practices. So this is a very good. The one I mentioned here is a very good sequence to take in. This is something that some practitioners, a few here in the Philippines, have adapted to so, and mostly are derived because it's legal requirements. And to summarize the whole thing up, ISO 14031 is a recommended guideline to extensively complement the the measurement aspect of the environmental performance of the organization. And with that, I hope that you were able to get some insights on this orientation and this webinar. And this literally ends my session. And I'd like to thank you guys for giving this your time in going through. Meanwhile, I'm turning you over to Susanna to talk more about these ISO 14001 training courses being offered by PECB. And we're grateful. Well, should we say it's an opportunity to have you with us on the trainings. So if you want to take up trainings on ISO 14001, you can always come to training organizations who are partners with PECB. That will be all. Thank you very much for the time. I'm turning you over now to Susanna. Susanna?
Yeah, thank you, Josh, very much for this presentation. As you already mentioned, before we go into questions, we want to inform you that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 40001, such as Introduction, Foundation, Lead Implementer, and Lead Auditor courses, and of course the transition course to ISO 40001-2015. These trainings will help your organization reduce any negative environmental impacts, and at the same time will help you grow your business. Just so you know, the exam and the certification fees are included in the training price, and also participation certificates of CPDs, or also known as continuing professional development, will be issued to participants. For more information, please visit our website pcb.com/training. Now we have some questions, Mr. Josh. So the first question is could you please go back to your slide where you make the distinction between strategic, tactic, and operational levels? I think it was slide number 8.
Okay.
Yes.
It's actually right over here. Okay.
Yeah, that one. Please give us a short example illustrating practically these 3 levels of decision and management making.
Okay, good question. Now, these 3 levels are, well, typically this represents the internal context. So to give you a brief example, when reporting the results at an operation, let's start with an operational level. Say a first line leader in a manufacturing company, um, on a on a daily performance, since we all know at an activity at an operational level, it's all about the daily grind of the job. So any line activities will represent the corresponding outputs. Now, for any environmental practitioner, which typically a setup is that a process, it's a dual function for a team leader, that not only performs on the production side but also on the environmental side. So what does it do then? Then it takes account it takes account the inventory of waste, the inventory of products, the inventory of products released. So this activity level data, this is something that most of the practitioners would ever collect, and also need to generate. On the other side, we talk about facilities management. We talk about the preventive maintenance activities. So what's going on right now on the facilities? Are they doing well? Another one would be the compressed dry air systems. What's the current operation of this one? What is the current performance of this? So these inputs are very critical, not just only on the business, but also in the environmental. For what reason? Energy. For dry air, it's energy. Why? Because while we delivered compressed air, which for most of the practitioners is somehow like inefficient, so these inputs are considered informative to the first line leaders. Now, what do these first line leaders perform? They have to process the data, they report it to the top level, or the top level will have to consolidate the information, consolidate all this data, and put it in sets of indicators. So for example, what's the current performance for the week? What is the current business performance? But at the same time, how much waste has been released? How much water has been consumed? How much what do you call this? Resources were utilized. So while we're talking about on the quality, we also talk about the environment. That's why for most organizations, quality management and environmental management will always come in handy, side by side most of the time. And the metrics for quality will also be significant for environmental, as much as environmental will also go for quality practices. So for example, if you want to reduce the environmental impacts, you got to improve your quality practice. So to lessen up your environmental waste, you got to lean up your practices. That's why operational excellence practices such as Six Sigma and Lean are considered a valuable tool. And may I, from a practitioner's perspective, a good practice in Six Sigma is a very good environmental practice. Now, going back to the main to the question, now that I mentioned to you these indicators that I mentioned, like the ones, the waste emitted, materials used, wastewater released, emissions, air emissions released. These are at the management level. These are things that the mid-level management has to handle, that they have to report it to the top level, where the top management is more focused on the business directions. The reason why the top management, always bear in mind that there is a reason why the top management wants to go for an ISO 14001 certification, simply because it has a value for them. For one of the probable values would be is that it has to comply for businesses, for legal compliance, and another one would be is to create a level of reputation, considering that especially if their products and services are for the benefit of the community. So it's more of creating a level of reputation. So what does the top management need? What information or what knowledge do they need to have? It's the context, it's the environmental context inside the organization. So where would he derive? What are the trends in the emissions? What are the trends in the consumption? What are the trends in environmental practices? How are they performing? And in what way can they present it one? That's why for the top management, sustainability reports are their major focuses. And in incoming such a substantial report, it's got to come from these two levels, from which I mentioned you earlier. It traces back to the simplest of activities. And for us to have a good representation, it warrants that it has to have a good set of metrics. And to do that, you have 14031. So I hope I answered your question right there. In the case of define on the strategic, tactical, and operational levels of reporting and defining the metrics. Susanna?
Thank you, Josh. What does it mean? What does the MFCA acronym stand for?
MFCA is an acronym for Material Flow and Cost Accounting. That is the guideline for ISO 14031. So if I'm going to go back on the deck, which I showed you, if ISO 14031 talks about environmental performance evaluation of an environmental management system, the Material Flow and Cost Accounting, or the MFCA, the ISO 14051, looks on the accounting side of the material flows in the business. Somehow at the moment the value is not so recognized yet, and this is something worth observing. And in what way will this create a level of benefit to creating substantial figures in the in evaluating environmental performance? And at the moment the version is 2011, so it's worth a watch. So I hope I got the answer there. Susanna?
Yes, Josh, we are unfortunately out of time, so I would like to thank you once again for your presentation. And thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave the webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you could complete that and provide your feedback. I would also like to inform you that next Friday we have an exclusive webinar with one of the ISO 45001 drafting contributors. He will give us exclusive insights on what the new standard will bring. On behalf of PCB and our presenter, thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great weekend.